A decorated federal agent was humiliated in public when Sergeant Tom Willis struck her simply for questioning his heavy-handed behavior. His arrogance, dripping with years of unchecked power, made the moment sting even more. But Danielle Parker had a move he never saw coming, the quiet flash of an FBI badge that turned his authority to dust. Just listen to how shocking the turn of events in this drama was, and why justice ultimately prevailed. The heavy air of Atlanta clung to the streets that Friday evening, pressing down on anyone who hadn't already escaped into the cool refuge of their homes. Danielle Parker, dressed neatly in a navy suit that carried the creases of a long week, pulled into a gas station she often passed on her commute. To an onlooker, she looked like any other professional woman winding down after work. No one could have guessed that she had spent the past 5 days buried in classified case files and tense meetings inside federal offices. Tonight, however, she wasn't Special Agent Parker of the FBI. She was simply Danielle, someone tired, thirsty, and looking for a quick coffee to stay awake for the last stretch of her drive. The station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she stepped inside, a cup in one hand and her car keys jingling lightly in the other. The atmosphere should have been mundane, even dull. But the moment she crossed the threshold, the energy in the room told her otherwise. Near the counter, 2 uniformed officers were locked in a loud exchange with the young clerk. The clerk, a wiry man with nervous hands, was insisting that a few teenagers lingering outside weren't causing any real trouble. The officers, their voices sharp and clipped, disagreed. Their words carried not just authority, but the edge of something more. Frustration, impatience, the kind of forcefulness that made customers shrink back into the aisles. Danielle stayed quiet. She wasn't here to intervene. She wasn't in the mood to be drawn into a small-town standoff about loitering. But as she waited for the coffee machine to sputter to life, her head moved almost involuntarily, a subtle shake at the unnecessary heat in the officer's tone. It wasn't dramatic, just the kind of human response one makes when something feels excessive. Unfortunately, that small gesture didn't go unnoticed. Sergeant Tom Willis, broad-shouldered with a face marked by years of unchecked confidence, caught her movement from the corner of his eye. He turned, his attention shifting from the clerk to Danielle. The hum of the store seemed to fade as his voice, laced with authority and irritation, rang out. "Got a problem with the way we handle things, lady?" Every set of eyes in the store moved to Danielle. She hadn't expected to be dragged into the scene, but she also wasn't the type to wilt under a question. Adjusting her posture, she responded evenly, her voice calm and clear. "Just seems a little much for people standing outside." The words weren't confrontational. They weren't shouted or laced with disrespect. But to Willis, they were enough. Enough to challenge the authority he wielded like a weapon. Enough to ignite whatever impatience had been building in him that day. What happened next unfolded so quickly that most in the store didn't even have time to process it. With a single step forward, Sergeant Willis closed the distance between them. His movement was sudden, jarring, and before Danielle or anyone else could react, his hand lashed out across her face. The sound cracked through the gas station like a gunshot, sharp and echoing. Danielle's head jerked slightly, her eyes blinking in stunned disbelief. The sting spread instantly across her cheek, but the greater wound wasn't physical. It was the realization, sudden, shocking, that a simple, measured comment had been met not with words, but with raw aggression. The entire store froze. A woman near the refrigerators clutched her cart tighter. The clerk, who had been arguing moments before, fell silent, his eyes wide. Even the younger officer standing beside Willis shifted uneasily, his jaw tightening as he tried to process what had just happened. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence that followed was heavier than the humid air outside, heavier than the fluorescent buzz above them. Danielle stood there, coffee cup trembling slightly in her hand, her cheek burning. She didn't say anything yet. Neither did anyone else. The moment held its breath, suspended, as if the whole room was waiting to see what would come next. Danielle's cheek still throbbed, a lingering heat that spread beneath her skin. The sting was sharp, but the wound cut deeper than the physical strike. She had built her entire life on discipline, service, and an unshakable belief in justice. She had taken oaths, worn a badge, and carried out duties that most people would never know about. She had worked long nights and risked herself in quiet ways so that others could feel safe. And yet here she was, inside a gas station she had entered only to buy a cup of coffee, treated not as a protector of the law, not even as a citizen deserving of respect, but as someone beneath the uniformed man in front of her. The humiliation pressed heavier than the pain itself. Danielle wasn't used to being made into a spectacle, and certainly not in front of strangers who now stood frozen, watching the scene like actors in a play who had forgotten their lines. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the younger officer. Officer Kelly couldn't have been more than 28, his frame still carrying the raw edges of a recruit not long removed from academy training. His shoulders shifted uneasily, his jaw tightening as though he wanted to say something but couldn't. His eyes flicked from Danielle to Sergeant Willis, then down to the floor. Loyalty bound him, fear silenced him. He was caught in the oldest trap of them all, obedience to authority versus the voice inside that whispered what was right. Danielle didn't blame him. She had seen that look before, even in her own colleagues. The hesitation of good people who knew better, but who weren't ready to risk themselves for it. It was compassion she felt in that moment, not just for herself, but for Kelly, who stood on the line of a choice that might one day define his career. The other customers had already made their choice. They turned away, their heads bowed toward products on the shelves they weren't really looking at. Murmurs spread, hushed, uneasy. Some pulled out their phones, half covering the screens with trembling hands, wanting to record but too nervous to be obvious. Their silence wasn't cruel, it was born of fear. Fear of being next, fear of becoming the target of Sergeant Willis's temper. Danielle could almost feel their thoughts. If it happened to her so quickly, what chance do the rest of us have? Her heart beat faster, not from panic, but from calculation. Every second stretched, and every breath was measured. Training kicked in, the kind drilled into her for years, not for scenes exactly like this one, but for moments where losing control meant losing everything. Danielle knew she had the authority to shut this down in an instant. She could reach into her purse, reveal the weight of the badge inside, and watch the sergeant's arrogance evaporate. But something inside her told her to wait. Timing mattered. Power wasn't only in possession, it was in the reveal, in choosing the exact moment when silence would end and truth would shatter illusion. So she stood there, coffee cup trembling just slightly in her hand, saying nothing. To Willis, her quiet might have looked like defeat. To the customers, it might have looked like fear. But in truth, it was neither. It was a silence heavy with intention, a silence that held back the storm. Her restraint was not weakness, it was weight. Every ounce of control she summoned in that moment was stronger than the blow she had received. Danielle's mind raced, her thoughts layered. Should she let this insult slide, blend back into anonymity, and drive home with only her pride wounded? Or should she remind these men who believed the badge on their chest made them untouchable, exactly who they had just laid hands on? She hadn't yet decided. But everyone in that gas station could feel it. Something was building, and when Danielle chose to act, nothing in that room would remain the same. Sergeant Tom Willis straightened his stance, his chest rising as though the entire room owed him its breath. His voice, loud and brash, carried through the gas station like the bark of a man too used to being obeyed. "That's what happens when people forget their place," he declared, his finger jabbing the air in Danielle's direction. "You don't talk back to me." His words weren't just meant for her. They were for everyone in the store, for every set of eyes now fixed on him. It was theater, dominance performed for an unwilling audience. His smirk deepened, the kind of smile that came from years of unchecked authority, from knowing that silence often followed his commands. To him, Danielle's composure was weakness. He saw her stillness not as discipline but as surrender. But the room was no longer still. Whispers broke through the hush, sharp and urgent, growing in volume with each passing moment. One man muttered under his breath, shaking his head. A woman near the shelves clutched her purse tighter, her face hard with disapproval. Another, hands trembling, pulled out her phone, raising it just high enough to catch the scene. The lens became a silent witness, its unblinking eye recording arrogance that could no longer hide behind authority. Willis caught sight of the phone, his smirk faltering for the briefest instant. But pride wouldn't let him back down. He turned his attention back to Danielle, convinced he could bend her silence into submission. Danielle's cheek still ached from the sting of his hand, but the sharper burn came from his words, from the assumption that she was powerless. Anger welled inside her, not the reckless kind that clouded judgment, but the focused kind, sharp as glass. Years in the bureau had taught her that true strength wasn't loud, it wasn't wild, it was quiet, precise, and devastating when unleashed. Her voice, when it finally cut through the tension, was calm but ironclad. "Sergeant," she said evenly, "you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." The words landed heavier than a shout. The crowd reacted first, a ripple of surprise traveling through them. Eyes widened. Murmurs grew louder. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Willis's face. He shifted slightly, caught off guard not by volume, but by certainty. Her tone carried no doubt, no hesitation. But arrogance is a stubborn shield. His lip curled, his voice rising again as if noise alone could drown her out. "Oh, really?" he sneered. "What are you gonna do? File a complaint? Good luck with that." He laughed, sharp and mocking, his confidence born from a lifetime of dodging accountability. The younger officer, Kelly, flinched at the sound, his discomfort now plain on his face. He looked between them, between the sergeant's inflated bravado and Danielle's unwavering composure, and something inside him seemed to fracture. The woman with the phone steadied her grip, no longer trembling. Others pulled their devices out as well, emboldened by Danielle's calm defiance. A murmur spread through the crowd. This wasn't just another scene of authority flexing power. This was something different. Something was shifting. Danielle held Willis's gaze, her eyes unblinking. She didn't raise her voice, didn't let her anger spill into chaos. Instead, she let the silence after his words hang heavy, daring him to fill it. In that silence, the weight of her anger became clear, not rage that lashed out blindly, but anger that calculated, measured, and promised consequences. Willis mistook calm for fear. The crowd, however, began to understand. Something in the air had changed. Danielle Parker wasn't a victim standing frozen in a gas station. She was a storm held back by choice, and every person watching could feel that when it broke, it would sweep the room clean. Danielle's hand moved with deliberate care, every gesture calm, precise, and loaded with intention. The silence inside the gas station thickened, the kind of silence that came just before something irreversible. Officer Kelly stiffened beside his superior, instinctively reaching toward his holster, his training whispering caution into his nerves. But Danielle didn't pull a weapon. Instead, she drew out a simple black leather case. With one practiced flick, she snapped it open and raised it high enough for the fluorescent lights above to catch on the polished gold inside. The emblem of the Federal Bureau of Investigation gleamed like a blade. The room reacted instantly. Gasps echoed from every corner. A man near the coffee station cursed under his breath in disbelief. The woman recording lowered her phone for just a moment, her mouth falling open before she quickly raised it again, knowing the footage had just transformed into something extraordinary. Kelly's face went pale, as though the blood had been drained from him in one swift motion. The authority he had leaned on only moments before seemed to dissolve in his hands. His eyes darted to his sergeant, wide and panicked, silently begging for direction that no longer existed. And Sergeant Tom Willis, so puffed up, so smug only seconds earlier, froze in place. His grin withered, collapsing under the weight of recognition. His swagger vanished, replaced by a dawning horror that spread across his face like cracks in stone. Danielle's voice cut through the gasps, steady and razor-sharp. "I'm Special Agent Danielle Parker with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," she declared, each syllable deliberate, leaving no space for denial. Then she delivered the blow that landed harder than the one she had received. "And you just assaulted a federal officer." The words hung in the air, unshakable and final. Willis stumbled back a step, his boots scuffing against the tile. For the first time in years, perhaps the first time in his career, he had no retort, no shield of arrogance to hide behind. His authority, once a weapon, now looked pitiful, stripped bare by a truth he couldn't bend. The crowd shifted, their fear evaporating, replaced by something else, something sharper, almost gleeful. The bystanders had witnessed humiliation dressed as power. Now they were watching power dressed as justice. The woman with the phone could barely contain her laughter. A sharp, delighted sound slipped from her lips as she steadied her recording. The irony was too perfect, too sweet to ignore. The man who had strutted, insulted, and struck without hesitation now stood exposed, powerless against the badge he had underestimated. Officer Kelly tried to recover, his words tumbling over one another. "Ma'am, I didn't—" His voice cracked, the defense faltering before it could take shape. Danielle silenced him with a single glance. It wasn't anger that held him quiet, but authority, the kind that didn't need to raise its voice to be obeyed. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he lowered his gaze to the floor. By the time backup arrived, the store had become a stage of pure reversal. Sergeant Willis, once so sure of himself, stood red-faced and cornered. His wrists were cuffed, his bluster gone, his fury now impotent against the very system he had thought he commanded. The crowd didn't pity him. There was no sympathy in their eyes, no hesitation in their smiles. Instead, there was something sharper, something closer to satisfaction. They had seen arrogance meet consequence, cruelty meet justice. They had watched the predator become the prey in the span of minutes. Danielle hadn't raised her hand, hadn't shouted, hadn't lost control. She had pulled justice from her purse, as simple and devastating as that. For the bystanders, it was a moment they would replay in their minds for years. Justice hadn't arrived with sirens or force. It had arrived with a badge, a steady voice, and the collapse of a man who believed himself untouchable. And the sweetest part? Watching him finally understand, too late, that the woman he thought powerless had always held the real authority.